4, verse 1 to 14, which you can find on page 93 of your church Bible. The Lord said to Moses, "Chisel out 2 stone tablets like the first ones, and I will write them on the words that were on the first tablets which you broke. Be ready in the morning, and then come up on Mount Sinai. Present yourself to me there on top of the mountain. No one is to come with you or be seen anywhere on the mountain. Not even the flocks and herds may graze in front of the mountain." So Moses chiseled out 2 stone tablets like the first ones, and went up to Mount Sinai early in the morning, as the Lord had commanded him. And he carried the 2 stone tablets in his hands. Then the Lord came down in a cloud and stood there with him and proclaimed his name, the Lord. And he passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the parents to the 3rd and 4th generation. Moses bowed down to the ground at once and worshipped. "Lord," he said, "if I have found favor in your eyes, then let the Lord go with us. Although this is a stiff-necked people, forgive our wickedness and our sin, and take us as your inheritance." Then the Lord said, "I am making a covenant with you. Before all your people, I will do wonders never before done in any nation in all the world. The people you live among will see how awesome is the work that I, the Lord, will do for you. Obey what I command you. I will drive out before you the Amorites, Canaanites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. Be careful not to make a treaty with those who live in the land where you are going, and they will be a snare among you. Break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, and cut down their Asherah poles. Do not worship any other god, for the Lord, whose name is a jealous God." The second reading is 1 Corinthians 10, verse 1 to 13, which you can find on page 1151 of your church Bibles. "For I do not want to be ignorant of the fact, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud, and that they all passed through the sea. They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank from the spiritual rock and accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them. Their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Now these things occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were, as it is written, 'People sat down to eat and drink, and got up to indulge in revelry.' We should not commit sexual immorality, as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 of them died. We should not test Christ, as some of them did, and were killed by snakes. And do not grumble, as some of them did, and were killed by the destroying angel. These things happened to them as examples and were written down as warnings for us, on whom the culmination of the ages has come. So if you think you are standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind. And God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so you can endure it."
Okay, well, let's draw things back together. If you've got your Bible, it would be really helpful, I think, this morning to turn to Exodus. There's some more Bibles at the side if you've not got one. But Exodus, starting at chapter 32, so page 91 in the church Bibles. As we come to that, let me, I guess, kind of in a sense, bring us back up to speed where we are in Exodus at this point. Now, God has saved his people from being slaves in Egypt. Remember, he rescued them through the plagues that he sent on Pharaoh and on Egypt. Eventually, he brought them out, and they went through the Red Sea, and they walked on the dry land as God saved them. He then took them through the desert, and God provided for them in the desert. He gave them water to drink, he gave them food to eat, he gave them spiritual leadership. And he led them all the way to Mount Sinai, the place he had said to Moses that he would take the people. And what we've been looking at over these past few weeks is what happens when they get to Mount Sinai. So first, God reminds them, he says, "Look, I am the God who has saved you." What comes next is not the thing which saves you. "I have saved you, I have brought you out to make me and I'm now going to come down on the mountain to meet with you and to be with you. And he gives them his law. He gives them it in 2 stages. The 10 Commandments, which we're looking at in our All In. And then in chapters 21 to 24, he gives them the book of the Covenant, which is more detailed laws. And then in chapters 25 to 31, he gives them the template of the place where he would dwell in the midst of the people, the tent in the middle, the tabernacle, the place where God would dwell with the people. And when you realise that history, you realise that the Israelites were given amazing spiritual blessings. It's what Paul outlines in that passage from 1 Corinthians 10 that Becca read for us. But Paul says this: I don't want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud, that they all passed through the sea. So he's picking up the language of the Exodus. They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and the sea. They all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. They had amazing spiritual blessings. But the people sin in the most heinous and egregious way. And we saw it last week as we looked at what they did with the golden calf. Moses has gone up the mountain to receive the law from God, and he's given that to the people. He's gone up and he's receiving the template for what God's dwelling will be like with the people. And at the bottom of the mountain, the people are turning away from God, rejecting God. God has saved them, provided for them, given them the law. He's making preparations to dwell with them. And the people, they are turning away from him. A rejection of all that God has done for them. As you read through verses 1 to 6 of chapter 32, you might think, well, they've not really turned away from the Lord, because in verse 5 they're going to have a festival to the Lord. But what you see is that they might keep kind of God in their thinking. They know God exists and know who he is, and yet they've mixed it up with all these different things which were not meant to be there. And they've made an idol, an image. And they're worshipping that. They are eating and drinking and indulging in revelry. It's syncretistic at best what they are doing. And when we don't follow God as he reveals it to us, when we mix it up with other things, then it's a travesty. It's almost as if this is God and the people, they've been brought together into this relationship. Could you imagine it when a couple, they get married, they're starting this relationship, and the wedding night one of them commits adultery? That's the kind of thing that's going on here with the golden calf. It's terrible. And that happens in verses 1 to 6 of chapter 32. And then what comes after those 6 verses, right the way through to chapter 34, is we find that God shows them the consequences of their sin. It will lead at the end of chapter 32, 3,000 people will die, the sword of the Levites and Moses at God's command. And more people will be afflicted with a plague, reminiscent of what happened to the Egyptians, those people who had rejected God. However, all of these events, through all of chapters 32 to 34, at the heart of them, what you've got is a dialogue between God and Moses. And I think it's quite spectacular what goes on in these verses. Through the dialogue, what we have is God declares what he is going to do. And then Moses intercedes for the people. He prays, in a sense, to God for the people in their sin. And what happens then is they have this dialogue as God says, this is what I'm going to do, and as Moses intercedes, and what happens is God's character is revealed to us so that we might understand God better. And I hope by the end of this morning we will come to see that God is someone who we should hold in utmost reverence and awe and not turn away from him. And yet God is someone who we also should treasure because of his amazing love and patience and kindness with people. And so the dialogue begins in chapter 32, verse 7, as God tells Moses what's going on and what he's going to do about it. Just look at verse 7. The Lord said to Moses, "Go down, because your people whom you brought up out of Egypt have become corrupt. They have been quick to turn away from what I commanded them, and have made themselves an idol cast in the shape of a calf. They've bowed down to it and sacrificed to it, and have said, 'These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt.' I have seen these people," the Lord said to Moses, "and they are a stiff-necked people. Now leave me alone so that my anger may burn against them, and that I may destroy them. Then I'll make you into a great nation." I wonder if you can sense the devastating nature of those words of God. God said, "Look, I've seen what's happened. I've seen these people are corrupt. They've created an idol. They've turned away from me." Of course, it's a reminder, isn't it? We sometimes think we can sin and do things and that God doesn't see. But of course, God sees everything, and he sees everything that these people have done. And his reaction? "Leave me alone so that my anger may burn against them, and that I may destroy them." See, these people, they've put themselves in a perilous position because of their sin. God's anger burns against them. Can you imagine that? His anger burns against them so that he might zot them off the earth. And so what does Moses do? Well, the one thing he doesn't do, he doesn't go away, but rather he talks to God, which I think is rather the point of what God is saying. He wants Moses to intercede like this. And so we have the first of Moses' intercession. Look what he says, verse 11. "But Moses sought the favour of the Lord his God. 'Lord,' he said, 'why should your anger burn against your people whom you brought out of Egypt with great power and a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say it was with evil intent that he brought them out to kill them in the mountains and to wipe them off the face of the earth? Turn from your fierce anger, relent, and do not bring disaster on your people. Remember your servants, Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, to whom you swore by your own self, I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and I will give your descendants all this land I promised them, and it will be their inheritance forever.' Then the Lord relented and did not bring on his people the disaster he had threatened." Again, not quite remarkable. No, God says, "Leave me alone that my anger may burn." And Moses intercedes with God. And the way he intercedes, he appeals to God's character. Did you see that? He says, "Lord, people will think badly of you. Your reputation would be damaged." The Egyptians would say, "See, he was evil all along. He just took them out so he might kill them in the desert." And Moses says, "Don't let your name be maligned in that way. Turn away from your anger." Then he reminds God of the covenant promises. Well, God had made these binding covenant promises to Abraham and then to Isaac and then to Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel. God had promised Abraham that his descendants would become as numerous as the stars in the sky. He had promised them that they would live in the land. Moses said, "Lord, remember your promise. Remember that you are a covenant-keeping, faithful God." And so God relents. Of course, I think what Moses says here to God, this didn't take God by surprise. No, God hadn't forgotten this is what he was like. No, I think he wanted Moses to take that position and to articulate those truths so that we might have them here. It's as if God says to Moses again, "Yes, Moses, you're exactly right. That is exactly who I am." And so he relents from his bringing disaster. See what we're learning about God? God is utterly opposed to sin. And yet, at the same time, he is jealous for his name. God is committed to his covenant promises. God never changes his mind. He is a faithful covenant-keeping God. It's a remarkable thing we learn about God. As Moses in verse 15 goes down from the mountain, he approaches the camp and Joshua is with them, and they hear the sound of singing. Joshua thinks it's war that's happening. Moses knows what's going on though, and as he approaches, he sees the full horror of what is happening. His anger is aroused, and he's coming down the mountain with the Ten Commandments under his arm. Imagine him kind of carrying these stone tablets, the Ten Commandments under his arms. He gets to the bottom of the mountain and he throws them on the ground and he's smashed. No, it's shocking. It's saying, this relationship with God, he's saying, look, you've broken it. It's smashed at the bottom of the mountain. The seriousness of what's going on. Moses, in verse 10, he takes the golden calf that he made, he grinds it up into a powder and mixes it with water and makes the Israelites drink that gold water. We're not entirely sure of the significance of it, but none of it is good. He confronts Aaron and says, what have you done? And Aaron shows himself to be a weak and ineffectual leader. In effect, he says, well, they gave me the gold, I put it in the fire, and out popped a calf. Whether he's deceiving himself or whether he's just lying, we don't really know. But it's just horrific, this turning away from God on the very days that God was forming the relationship with the people. And judgment does fall. 3,000 people die. The next day Moses says he will go and speak with God again. If you look to verse 30. The next day Moses said to the people, you've committed great sin. But now I will go up to the Lord. Perhaps I can make atonement for your sin. Moses goes back to God on behalf of the people. He thinks, maybe I can make atonement for them. And so in verse 31, he says to God, oh, what a great sin these people have committed. They have made themselves gods of gold. But now, please forgive their sin. But if not, then blot me out of your book you have written. Now here's Moses. He's saying, look, I'm willing to die for these people. Is that not quite something? It's a shadow. God says, no, you can't do that. But really, it's just a shadow of what the Lord Jesus would come. When God's Son came to earth, he would die in the place of people. But Moses couldn't do it. You see verse 33. The Lord replied to Moses, whoever has sinned against me, I will blot out of my books. Now go, lead the people to the place I spoke of, and my angel will go before you. However, when the time comes for me to punish, I will punish them for their sin. You see, yes, God's relented. But it doesn't mean that he sweeps sin under the carpet as if it doesn't matter. The next dialogue begins in chapter 33 as God says this, leave this place, you and the people you brought up out of Egypt, and go up to the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I will send an angel before you and drive out the Canaanites, Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. Go up to the land flowing with milk and honey. But I will not go with you, because you are a stiff-necked people, and I might destroy you on the way. See what happened in chapter 33? God says, look, I'm going to destroy the people. He's relented from destroying the people. But chapter 33, he's sent an angel with them, but he won't go with them himself. It's almost as if God is washing his hands of the people. Leave this place, you and the people that you brought up. Notice the language God is using here. Leave this place, you and the people you brought up. Now, before it was, these are my people, my treasured possession. Now they're Moses' people. And while God will send the people and send an angel with them, he won't go with them because he might destroy them, he says. They can go on their own. Again, you see what sin does? It creates that barrier between God and people. God can't come and dwell with them because of their sin. And the people start to get that. See verse 4? When the people heard these distressing words, they began to mourn, and no one put on any ornaments. For the Lord had said to Moses, "Tell the Israelites, you are a stiff-necked people. If I were to go with you, even for a moment, I might destroy you. Now take off your ornaments, and I will decide what to do with you." See, the people realize, no, God's not going to go with them. God is now against them in some sense. You see, God saved them so they might be in relationship with Him. And now that relationship seems like it is threatened. In verse 7 to 11, there's a discussion about this tent that Moses builds. He builds a tent that's outside of the camp, and in this tent, Moses goes outside the camp and meets with God. And as Moses goes out to meet with God, all the people in the camp, they're watching on. That was kind of the picture of them watching in bated breath. What's going to happen? Moses is out there with God. And I think in verse 12, what we get is a snapshot of what maybe the discussion between God and Moses is like. Look at verse 12. Moses said to the Lord, "You've been telling me, lead these people, but you've not let me know whom you will send with me. You've said, I know you by name, and you've found favor with me. If you're pleased with me, teach me your ways, so that I may know you and continue to find favor with you. Remember that this nation is your people." Verse 14, the Lord replied, "My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest." And then Moses said to him, "If your presence does not go with us, do not send us up from here. How will anyone know that you are pleased with me and with your people unless you go with us? What else will distinguish me and your people from all the other people on the face of the earth?" Here's Moses is picking up something that God is saying. That God is saying, "Look, Moses, I will go with you. Moses, you will be my man. You will be the person I'm with." And the implication is he won't be with the people. But Moses is saying, "No, God, don't do that. Go with us. With all of us. We need your presence with us, Lord." Moses is distressed that if God's presence was not with them, then what was the point? You see, he wants to be in the presence of God. And the golden calf incident had threatened God's presence with them. And in response to Moses' petition, God says, verse 17, "I will do the very thing you have asked, because I'm pleased with you and I know you by name." And Moses has prayed for the people, and God has listened to his prayer, listened to his intercession. Then Moses makes the request, which brings everything together, if you like. In verse 18, it's almost as if it's going to say, "Okay, Lord, I've heard what you've said, but I want more." So verse 18, he says, "Then show me your glory. Give me something to have real confidence that what you say is true." So verse 19, Lord, in verse 18, Moses says, "Show me your glory." Verse 19, and the Lord said, "I will cause all my goodness to pass in front of you, and I will proclaim my name, the Lord, in your presence. I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion." But he said, "You cannot see my face, for no one may see me and live." Then the Lord said, "There is a place near me where you may stand on a rock. When my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft in the rock and cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will remove my hand, and you will see my back, but my face must not be seen." See, Moses is saying, give me some assurance. And God said he was going to cause all of his goodness to pass in front of Moses. Moses wouldn't actually see God, he'd be covered. There's God's hand. We don't know what it looks like. None of it. It's all very vague what this would actually look like for Moses. But God is going to cover him and pass by. So Moses would see God's back and see his glory. That's what happens. Well, in the beginning of chapter 34, Moses makes some new stone tablets to take up so that God could chisel on write the Ten Commandments again on the stones. And then Moses sees God's glory. Well, actually, I don't think he does see God's glory. He doesn't see it. He actually hears it. And he hears it not in a rumble of thunder or some kind of awesome rumbling which is happening around him. No, he hears it in God proclaiming his name. And it draws everything together that we've been seeing in these chapters. Verse 6. This is a memory verse, if ever there was one to kind of commit to memory. Verse 6. And he passed by, the Lord passed by in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger and abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation. It's worth saying that again. The Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. God's glory is his name. He is the Lord. He is Yahweh. Moses wants to see his glory. He hears God's name. And it draws out, doesn't it, what we've seen Moses interceding with God about. Yahweh is compassionate and gracious. He doesn't give the people what they deserve for their sin. He is slow to anger. God's anger is not hot-headed. He doesn't just fly off the handle. His anger is his controlled, settled hostility to all that is evil. He is abounding in love and faithfulness. He is keeping his promises. He is going to go with the people. He's going to be faithful to them. He will make them into that great nation. He will bring them into the land. He will and he has blessed the whole world through Abraham's descendants. God maintains his love to thousands. He forgives wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Do you not think we need to hear that this morning? This is our God. And yet, on the other hand, we see the same things we saw in the passages in the next bit as well, don't we? God will not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes sin. We see 3,000 people died because of their sin. A plague came on the people. There was an impairment in the relationship. And you might then wonder, well, how does that first half of verse 6 go with the end of those verses? How can God be gracious and compassionate and slow to love and forgiving sin and yet not allowing the guilty to go free? How can God do that? It seems a contradiction. And it's precisely, isn't it, where Jesus fits in. Moses interceded for the people. Jesus intercedes for the people. Moses said, let me take their place. Jesus did take our place. As he went to the cross and as darkness fell, and as the wrath of God and the anger of God for sin fell on Jesus, the one who was completely sinless, he stood in the place of those who deserved God's judgment. God's wrath and mercy meeting on the cross. So that we can see God is gracious and compassionate. Do you remember Jesus' words as he hung on the cross? Bearing the wrath of God, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. The graciousness and the kindness of God. And yet the justice of God. It's what we've got communion this morning. We'll remember as we have a little bit of bread and the wine, we'll remember that Jesus' body was broken, his blood was shed, so that we might have forgiveness of sins. That's who our God is. But there's another way that these verses should hit us as well. Because in the New Testament, Paul picks up these verses in the passage Becca read from 1 Corinthians 10. Turn there, we'll finish with these verses. So 1 Corinthians 10 is page 1151. 1 Corinthians 10. 1 Corinthians 10, 1, verses 1 to 4, remember we were saying that Paul says the Israelites, they had great spiritual blessings. But verse 5, nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them. Their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. And in verse 6, Paul says this, now these things occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. Paul then lists some of the things that they did, one of which is the golden calf incident. Verse 11, these things happened to them as examples and were written down as warnings for us, on whom the culmination of the ages has come. So if you think you are standing firm, be careful that you do not fall. No temptation is overtaking you except what is common to mankind. Do you see the thing that was said twice? These things. The example of the Israelites back then, they happened as examples for us. Examples so that we might learn who God is, but also examples so that we might not do what they did. So that we might not fall away, turn away from God. And if we think we are standing firm in our faith, then be careful. I remember a lad once that I knew, and he hadn't been coming to church very regularly, as maybe there kind of one Sunday every kind of 2 Sundays, kind of missed kind of 50% of the time. And I remember having a conversation with him and saying, you need to be careful what's going on here. God says in his word, in Hebrews 10, don't neglect meeting with God's people. There's a reason why God says that. And remember what he says. He said, well, I'll never fall away. That won't happen to me. You see, when we take what God says in his word and then think, well, that doesn't really apply to me, I will be okay. I don't need to follow God in this way. Paul says, be careful, lest you fall. You see, the Israelites, they knew God's word, they knew God, they rebelled against him nonetheless. They turned away from him. So we might do that through our church attendance, or we might do it in all those other ways. A couple of examples, but there's many other ways which you might look at God's word and think, yeah, but that doesn't really apply to me. Maybe it's the way that we don't serve in church anymore. Maybe because we've got a busy, challenging job, so we've got hobbies which take lots of time. Sometimes because we just don't like the jobs on offer. We don't want to do that kind of job, or with those people. And so we hold ourselves on the edge. Whereas God says, actually, we should be serving wholeheartedly in God's family. Beware. Other times it's sexual sin which pulls us away, isn't it? Some people think, well, it's okay to have sex outside of marriage. We can still come to church, we can still follow God, it's not got any consequence for me. Paul says, beware. Or any of those times you say, well, yeah, I know the Bible says that, but and then we kind of fill in the blanks. Paul says, beware. Or I say, I know what God's will is that but I want to, and we add in the blank again with something that we want to do. It's not so subtle as saying we have completely turned and walked away from God. But when we start to mix it up and we pick and choose, then actually we have turned away from God. As the Israelites did at the Mount Sinai with their golden calf. And when we do that, danger bells should ring. And it should cause us to come back to the God who is gracious and compassionate, but who punishes sin. Remembering that we can't trifle with God. Let me finish with this thought. These verses in Exodus help us to see that salvation is about a relationship with God. Salvation is not a mechanical equation. You say some words and then you can get eternal life, and then from there I can just get on with my life. A bit like at school, you get your vaccinations, you get your kind of the shot in the arm, it hurts for a few days, and then you forget about it for the rest of your life, and you don't worry about it. salvation is not like that. The salvation is you are drawn into a relationship with the God who made all things, the God that you rebelled against, sinned against, were an enemy with, we were alienated from, and you're brought into relationship with him again. And the relationship is ongoing. This is when you get married, it changes the relationship that you have. You live with and for the other person. You can't live like you did before, otherwise you break the relationship. And the same with God. We live in relationship with him. Our God, who is the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger and abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin, and yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. Before we come to celebrate communion together, we're going to sing a song, which really is a prayer that we might not be like those who turn away. The great God of highest heaven might be everything to us. So let's stand and sing this as a prayer together.
Your word gives life to all who hear and obey. Your word endures forever.